You're the only one who makes me feel beautiful, my friend's aunt whispered in her sleep. Hello, I'm Ethan, 26 artist, currently house-sitting Marcus's apartment while he travels for work. Diana arrived at midnight with a lost hotel reservation and exhausted eyes. Marcus's aunt? Though she couldn't be more than 42, I gave her the couch, a blanket, some tea. 2 hours later, those words stopped me cold. She was dreaming of someone else, someone who'd made her invisible. I covered her better with the blanket, went back to my painting, tried not to think about the sadness in her voice. 3 nights later, she'd say those exact words again, wide awake, to me. But before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. I was still awake when the knocking started, brush hovering over canvas as I tried to capture the way city lights filtered through Marcus's floor-to-ceiling windows. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Midnight plays tricks on your mind when you're alone with your art. But then it came again, more insistent this time. No one had visited in the 2 weeks I'd been house-sitting. My paintings and supplies had slowly taken over the spare room, turning it into an impromptu studio that felt more like home than my own apartment. I set down my brush, wiping my hands on my already paint-stained jeans as I moved toward the door. The knocking continued, not aggressive but persistent. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, elegant even in obvious exhaustion. Her dark hair swept back from her face, one hand resting against the doorframe as if it were holding her up. I opened the door, and she straightened. Immediately, composing herself, "I'm so sorry to disturb you this late," she said, her voice carrying the slight roughness of a long day. "I'm Diana, Marcus's aunt. He's mentioned that you might be staying here." There was something in her careful posture that made my chest tighten, a fragility she was trying hard to hide. Behind her stood an expensive-looking suitcase, the kind with perfect wheels that probably never squeaked. "My hotel lost my reservation," she continued, smoothing her blazer with one hand. "Marcus has always said I could stay here if I needed to, but I couldn't reach him, and She trailed off, and I caught the slight tremor in her fingers as they dropped from her blazer. You know those moments when you can tell someone's night has gone so wrong that they've ended up somewhere they never expected to be? This felt like one of those double quotes. "Please, come in," I said, stepping aside. "I'm Ethan. Marcus mentioned you might stop by sometime." That was a small lie. He'd mentioned having an aunt in passing, but nothing about potential visits. Still, the relief in her eyes made it worth it. As she crossed the threshold, something shifted in her demeanor. The practiced poise seemed to fade, leaving her looking smaller, somehow more vulnerable. I watched as she took in the familiar space of her nephew's apartment, now slightly altered by my presence, easel visible through the spare room door. A few brushes soaking in a jar by the kitchen sink. "Can I make you some tea?" I offered, recognizing the lost look of someone who needed a moment to gather themselves. "Marcus keeps an impressive collection." Diana nodded, settling onto one of the kitchen stools. "That would be lovely, thank you." Her fingers began tracing patterns on the marble countertop, known conscious movements that seemed to write invisible messages only she could read. I filled the electric kettle, sneaking glances at her as I moved around the kitchen. The overhead lights caught the silver threading through her dark hair, and there was an elegance to her even in this moment of obvious distress. Whatever had brought her here at midnight wasn't something she was ready to share, but I could see it weighing on her shoulders. The kitchen fell quiet except for the growing whisper of the kettle. I pulled down Marcus's tea collection, all properly loose leaf, because of course it was, and selected a caffeine-free blend that smelled of chamomile and lavender. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is pretend everything. It is normal when it clearly isn't. Diana's fingers continued their silent writing on the counter, and I wondered what stories they were trying to tell. What kind of night leads someone to show up unannounced at their nephew's apartment, knowing he's away? What pushes us to those places where we have to choose between pride and necessity? I didn't ask any of these questions. Instead, I focused on the familiar ritual of making tea, letting the gentle routine fill the midnight silence between us. I reached for Marcus's most delicate teacups, the ones he probably never used, and measured out the chamomile blend. The kettle clicked. Often I let the water cool for a minute before pouring. "No one needs scalded tea at midnight. Marcus mentioned you're an artist." Diana's voice was softer now, fatigue seeping through the polite inquiry. She'd slipped off her blazer, draping it carefully over the adjacent stool, revealing a silk blouse that caught the kitchen's dim light. I slid her cup across the counter. "That's why all the supplies everywhere. Sorry about the chaos, I didn't expect company." She wrapped her fingers around the cup, breathing in the steam. "No, please. It makes the place feel lived in. Marcus's apartments always look like hotel rooms, even when he's home." "He does travel a lot," I agreed, leaning against the counter. "London this month, I think." "Singapore," she corrected, taking a careful sip, though it's hard to keep track these days. "The apartment suits him though, all these clean lines and perfect angles." Her eyes drifted to where my easel stood, visible through the spare room doorway. Canvas turned away from view, But it's nice seeing some art on the walls, even temporarily. There was something in the way she said temporarily that made me wonder if she was talking about more than my paintings. I watched as she stifled a yawn behind her hand, her shoulders drooping slightly. You should take the bedroom, I offered. I've been using the spare room anyway. Oh no, she straightened, that careful mask slipping back into place. The couch is fine. I'll sort everything out tomorrow. Find a proper hotel. This is just for tonight. I knew better than to push. At least let me get you some proper bedding. I headed to the hallway closet where Marcus kept the good linens, the ones his mother had sent from some fancy store I'd probably never shop at, when I returned with an armful of pillows and the softest blanket I could find. Diana had moved to the living room. She'd kicked off her heels, and without them, she seemed smaller somehow, more human. The moonlight through the windows caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment she looked lost in thought, staring out at the city below. These should help, I said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and that practiced smile returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Thank you, Ethan. You're very kind. She accepted the bedding, and I pretended not to notice how her hands trembled slightly. If you need anything, I'll be up for a while. Painting? You know, night owl habits. She nodded, already arranging the pillows with precise movements. I retreated to the spare room, leaving her to settle in private. I tried to focus on my canvas, but the unexpected presence in the apartment kept drawing my attention. The soft sounds of someone else moving around, the quiet click of a lamp being turned off. It changed the whole feeling of the space. 2 hours passed as I worked, adding layers to a piece I wasn't sure would ever be finished. Around 2 in the morning, I needed water and maybe a snack. Artists' hours are never normal hours. I padded quietly toward the kitchen, not wanting to wake Diana, but as I passed the living room, I heard its soft words, barely above a whisper at first. I thought she was awake, maybe on the phone, but no. Her breathing had the deep rhythm of sleep. I shouldn't have moved closer, shouldn't have listened, but something in her voice drew me in. You're the only one who makes me feel beautiful, she murmured, face turned toward the back of the couch. One hand clutched the blanket I'd given her, knuckles white even in the darkness. The words held a rawness and honesty that made me feel like an intruder in my own borrowed space. I stepped back carefully, my artist's eye catching the vulnerability in her sleeping form, the curve of her shoulder, the tension in her fingers, the way she'd curled inward as if protecting herself from something, or someone. This wasn't just about a lost hotel reservation. People don't end up on their nephew's couch at midnight talking about beauty in their sleep because of a booking error. They end up there because they're running from something that hurt them deeper than they're ready to admit. I forgot about my water and returned to the spare room, but I couldn't focus on painting anymore. Diana's sleep-spoken words kept echoing in my head, making me wonder what kind of night, what kind of life, had led her here. I woke to the gentle hiss of Marcus's coffee maker and the sound of someone trying very hard to be quiet. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, and for a moment, I forgot why I was on the couch instead of in the spare room. Then, I remembered Diana, Marcus's aunt, the midnight arrival. When I padded into the kitchen, she was standing there in yesterday's silk blouse and tailored pants, looking like she'd tried to smooth out the wrinkles with her hands. Her face flushed when she saw me. I'm so sorry, she said immediately, hands fluttering between the coffee maker and an empty mug. I shouldn't have touched. I should have asked first. Hey, coffee's meant to be made, I said, reaching past her for another mug. Marcus would probably be thrilled someone's finally using his fancy machine properly. I just push buttons until caffeine happens. She didn't laugh, but her shoulders lowered slightly. About last night, she began, then stopped, staring into her empty cup. I really can't thank you enough for your kindness, but I'll be out of your way today. I've already looked up some hotels, and there's one just stay, I said, surprising myself with how quickly the word came out. The memory of her sleep-talking lingered, that vulnerable confession about feeling beautiful. Something in me couldn't bear the thought of her checking into some sterile hotel room alone. Marcus won't be back for another week, and the guest room's just sitting there collecting my art supplies. Diana's fingers tightened around her mug. That's very generous, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition. Look, the room's already set up, and honestly, I gestured to my paint-stained clothes. I've been working late most nights anyway. I'm more comfortable on the couch, closer to the coffee maker. She glanced toward the spare room, then back at me. I could see the internal debate playing across her features, pride warring with practicality. If you're absolutely certain I am. I poured coffee into both our mugs. We can work out schedules, make sure we're not in each other's way. The apartment's big enough. Diana moved through the kitchen like a ghost, each movement measured and careful. She opened a cabinet looking for sugar, then immediately apologized for the intrusion. When she reached for a spoon, her movements were so precise it was like she was afraid of disturbing the air around her. The kitchen's meant to be used, I said gently, sliding the sugar bowl closer to her. Marcus would want you to feel at home. Here, she added sugar to her coffee with the same precise movements, stirring exactly 3 times before setting the spoon in the sink. We should establish some ground rules. she said, her professional tone at odds with the way she seemed to shrink against the counter. I don't want to interfere with your work schedule. Simple enough. I usually paint late into the night, but I'll keep the noise down. The spare room guest room now is all yours. I've got my supplies mostly contained to one corner, and I'll be out most days, she added quickly, looking for. She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. Well, I have arrangements to make. I pretended not to notice the way her voice caught. Sounds good. We'll barely cross paths. Diana nodded, relief evident in her posture. She picked up her suitcase, the expensive one that had appeared at midnight, and moved toward the spare room. In the doorway, she paused, one hand resting lightly on the frame. Are you absolutely sure about this arrangement? The morning light caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment, I saw again how carefully she held herself, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Someone had taught her that, I realized. Someone had made her believe she needed to apologize for existing in a space. I'm sure, I said firmly. Take the room, Diana, please. She gave me a small nod and disappeared inside, closing the door with barely a sound. I stood in the kitchen, coffee cooling in my hand, wondering what stories lay behind her midnight arrival and measured movements. What makes someone so afraid of disturbing the world around them? I've always believed art finds its way to the people who need it. That's why. The morning after Diana moved in, I started leaving sketches around the apartment like breadcrumbs. Nothing too obvious, just quick studies on printer paper, placed where she might stumble across them during her careful navigation of our shared space. The first one was a loose gesture, drawing of hands. Left near the coffee maker, I'd drawn them from memory, her fingers tracing patterns on the counter that first night. When I came back from my morning shower, the paper had shifted slightly, though Diana was absorbed in reading something on her phone. By afternoon, an abstract study of light and shadow found its way to the kitchen counter. Later, a figure sketch, nothing too detailed, just the suggestion of someone standing in a doorway, appeared near the fruit bowl. I never mentioned them, and neither did she, but I caught her pausing each time she discovered one. Her fingers would hover just above the paper, trembling slightly, like she wanted to touch but couldn't give herself permission. The apartment started smelling like home-cooked meals around 6 that evening. I was working on a larger canvas in my corner of the living room when the scent of sautéed garlic and onions drifted over. Diana moved through the kitchen with the same precise care she applied to everything, but there was a rhythm to her cooking that seemed almost peaceful. I hope you don't mind, she said, noticing me watching. I thought, since you're letting me stay, it smells amazing, I told her, and the smallest smile touched her lips before disappearing. We ate at opposite ends of the counter, maintaining careful distance. The conversation stayed in safe territory. How unseasonably warm it had been. Marcus's latest consulting project, whether the pizza place down the street was really the best in the city. But I noticed how Diana's phone kept drawing her attention, the screen lighting up every few minutes. Each time she checked it, her face fell a little more before she'd set it face down with studied casualness. These tomatoes, I said, trying to pull her attention back from whatever disappointment lived in that phone. They taste different than the ones I usually get. Heirloom varieties, she explained, seeming grateful for the distraction. The market on 7th Street carries them. They cost a bit more, but the flavor, she trailed off, looking almost embarrassed at her enthusiasm. No, you're right, I said quickly. They make the whole dish different, better. After dinner, we fell into an unplanned rhythm, Diana washing dishes while I dried them. The clink of plates and soft running water filled the silence until she spoke, so quietly, I almost missed it. I used to paint. I nearly dropped the bowl I was drying. Yeah, years ago. She handed me a glass, not meeting my eyes. Before life got complicated. What made you stop? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while my heart picked up speed. Here was the thread I'd been hoping to find. The connection hidden beneath her careful exterior. Diana's hands stilled in the soapy water. Sometimes you lose things so gradually you don't notice until they're gone, she said finally. Like watching the sun set, you know it's happening, but you can't pinpoint the exact moment darkness falls. The weight of unspoken history hung in her words. I wanted to ask more, to understand what or who had dimmed her light so slowly she hadn't noticed until it was too late. But the set of her shoulders warned me away from deeper questions. Instead, I said, the spare room has decent, natural light. If you ever wanted it, I let the offer hang there, unfinished. Diana's hands moved mechanically over the last few dishes. That's kind of you, she said in that measured voice that seemed to hold everything at arm's length. But I wouldn't know where to begin anymore. I dried the final plate in silence, watching her from the corner of my eye. She was staring at the window above the sink, but I didn't think she was seeing the view. Her reflection looked lost in memories, and I wondered if she could see the ghost of who she used to be, back when she still allowed herself to create. The phone on the counter lit up again. Diana's face tightened as she dried her hands and turned it over, then back again without checking the message. Whatever she was running from, it kept finding ways to remind her it was still there. I'd been staring at the same canvas for 3 hours, and nothing was working. The figures refused to come together. The composition felt hollow despite being crowded with shapes. and my frustration was building with every failed adjustment. Sometimes painting feels like trying to have a conversation in a language you've suddenly forgotten. The apartment had grown dark around me while I worked, the only illumination coming from my desk lamp and the city lights filtering through the windows. I barely registered the soft footsteps behind me until Diana's voice broke the silence. "You're up late." I didn't turn around, still frowning at the canvas. "Yeah, sorry if the light bothered you. I can move to the spare room." "No, it's fine. I couldn't sleep anyway." She moved closer, and I could sense her studying the painting over my shoulder, maintaining that careful distance she always kept. "May I look?" "Sure," I said, leaning back so she could see better, "though I'm not sure what you're looking at." "Nothing's working tonight." Diana was quiet for a long moment, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for her assessment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "The central figure looks lonely." I turned to look at her, surprised by the observation. The way she said it, not as a criticism but as a simple truth, made me see my own work differently. Diana's eyes met mine briefly before returning to the canvas, and in that moment, I recognized something in her gaze, a familiar shadow I'd been trying to capture and paint. "Maybe that's what the painting is really about," she continued, gesturing toward the crowd of figures I'd placed around the central one. "All these people, but they're not really connecting, are they?" "No," I admitted, seeing it clearly for the first time. "They're not." Diana's hand rested on the back of my chair, not quite touching where I sat. "Sometimes isolation isn't about being alone," she said, her voice taking on a distant quality. "It's about being unseen, even in crowds. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're speaking a language no one else understands." "Sounds like experience talking," I said quietly, watching her reflection in the window beside us. The smile that crossed her face was brief and bittersweet. "The conference I just left, ... She paused, collecting her thoughts. 3 days of presentations and networking events, hundreds of people in suits and name tags, all talking about pharmaceutical developments and market projections. And the whole time, I felt like a ghost. Like I could have evaporated in the middle of a meeting and no one would have noticed. I turned fully in my chair then, wanting to offer some comfort. But Diana was already stepping back, reconstructing that careful distance. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head. "I shouldn't be dumping this on you. You're trying to work." "No, I started." But she was already retreating. "The younger colleagues talk through me in meetings now," she added, almost to herself. "I've become ... functional furniture. Present but not really there." She lingered in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame like she wanted to say more. The lamp cast soft shadows across her face, and for a moment I could see exactly how I'd paint her. Not the composed woman who moved so carefully through the apartment, but this version, the one who understood lonely figures in crowded scenes. "Diana," I said, but she was already waving off whatever I might have offered. "You should get back to your work," she said, her voice returning to its usual, measured tone. "Thank you for letting me look." She stood there a moment longer, and I had the distinct feeling she was struggling with whether to say something else. But then her phone buzzed from wherever she'd left it, and the spell broke. Diana disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with my canvas and the echo of recognition still hanging in the air. I turned back to the painting, seeing it completely differently now. The lonely figure at the center wasn't a failed composition, it was the whole point. I picked up my brush, understanding finally what the piece had been trying to tell me all along. By the third day, Diana and I had fallen into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. The morning started with coffee. She'd wake first, brew enough for 2, and I'd emerge from wherever I'd fallen asleep to find a steaming mug waiting. We'd sit in companionable silence, the early light painting soft patterns across the kitchen counter while she read the news on her tablet and I sketched in my notebook. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Diana first really opened up about the conference. She'd been staring at her coffee for several minutes, lost in thought, when she suddenly spoke. "Do you know what it's like when people look right through you?" I glanced up from my sketchbook. "In what way?" "At the conference," she said, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger. "The younger colleagues, they talk through me in meetings now, like I'm just ... part of the furniture. The one who takes notes, makes copies, remembers everyone's coffee order." She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "At 42, that's what happens to professional women, unless they're running the show. And I was never aggressive enough to climb that ladder." I set down my pencil, giving her my full attention. "That sounds incredibly frustrating." "It is." Diana's shoulders tensed slightly. "You spend years building expertise, and then one day you realize you've become invisible. Unless someone needs the minutes from last week's meeting or help with the copier jam." Something about her words resonated with a familiar ache. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a stack of letters, sliding them across the counter to her. "Speaking of invisibility," Diana picked up the top letter, her eyes scanning the carefully worded rejection. "While technically proficient, we find the work lacks that ineffable quality we seek for our gallery space," she read aloud. "Oh, that's painful." "They're all variations on the same theme," I said, spreading out more letters. "Technically skilled but missing something. present, but not quite seen. It's like they're all trying to find a polite way to say I'm furniture too, functionally competent but forgettable. Diana's expression softened with recognition. So we're both invisible in our own ways. Me because of age, you because— She gestured toward my latest canvas. Because I can make pretty pictures that don't move anyone, I finished. Technical presence without emotional impact. Is that why the painting feels lonely? Diana asked, nodding toward the piece I'd been struggling with. Because it's about being technically present but emotionally erased. The insight hit me like a physical thing. I grabbed my sketchbook, suddenly needing to capture something I couldn't quite name. As we talked, my pencil moved across the paper. Quick lines catching Diana mid-gesture, the tilt of her head, the thoughtful pause of her hand above her coffee mug. She noticed what I was doing but didn't ask me to stop. Instead, she continued talking, her posture relaxing slightly. You know what's strange? I used to love those conferences. I'd get excited about sharing ideas, making connections. Now I spend 3 days watching younger women command the room, while I fade into the wallpaper. My pencil captured the subtle shift in her expression, the moment of vulnerability quickly masked by practiced composure. She was still talking, but I was struck by how much she said in the spaces between words, in the way she held herself, in the careful arrangement of her hands, in the things she left unspoken. You're not wallpaper, I said quietly, adding shadow to the sketch. You're quiet, see things others miss. Like with the painting, you saw straight to its heart when I was still struggling to understand it. Diana watched my pencil move across the paper, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Maybe that's the gift of invisibility, she mused. When no one's looking at you, you learn to really look at everything else. We sat there in the morning light, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who recognized something of themselves in each other's absence. Diana continued reading her tablet, occasionally making observations about articles that caught her attention, while I filled page after page with quick studies, her hands, her profile, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when deep in thought. Neither of us mentioned the growing stack of sketches, or how her posture had slowly unwound from its usual careful precision, or how the morning light had turned to afternoon shadows while we sat there, two invisible people seeing each other clearly for the first time. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the city like an angry tide. I was cleaning brushes in the kitchen sink when the first thunderclap shook the windows, and Diana looked up from her book on the couch, startled by its violence. That came out of nowhere, she said, marking her page as she stood to peer out. The window of the sky had turned an ominous green-black, and fat raindrops began to splatter against the glass. The lights flickered once, a warning pulse that made us both pause. Then again, longer this time, before everything went dark with a soft electrical sigh. The sudden absence of the building's constant hum left an eerie silence, broken only by the intensifying storm. Don't move, I called to Diana's direction, remembering the layout of Marcus's apartment. There are candles in the kitchen drawer by the fridge. I could hear her fumbling with her phone, and then a beam of light cut through the darkness. Got it, she said, pointing the phone's flashlight toward me. Lead the way. Together we located the emergency supplies, thick pillar candles, matches, and a few tea lights. I arranged them on the coffee table while Diana held the lights steady. The storm gained strength outside, wind driving rain against the windows in sheets. We might as well get comfortable, I suggested, lowering myself to sit on the floor beside the coffee table. Power outages in this part of the city can last a while. Diana hesitated for a moment before joining me, settling cross-legged on the other side of the flickering candles. The storm cast strange shadows on the walls, and thunder rolled continuously overhead. In the warm candlelight, her face looked softer, less guarded than usual. I should probably confess something, she said after a while, watching the flame of the nearest candle dance. The conference wasn't the only reason I came to the city. I waited, letting the silence give her space to continue. I needed to prove something to myself, she went on, her voice quiet but steady, that I could still take risks, still surprise myself, that I hadn't completely become this predictable, careful person who never does anything unexpected. She gave a small laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Instead, the conference just confirmed every fear about aging out of relevance, about becoming invisible. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the whole room in stark white before plunging us back into candlelight. I thought about the sketch I'd started that morning, how different it felt from my usual work. I've been working on something new, I said carefully. This morning, while you were reading, it's not like my usual abstracts. Diana tilted her head, curious. May I see it? Even in this light, I hesitated, suddenly nervous. It's not finished, I warned, but I was already standing to retrieve the sketchbook from where I'd left it in the spare room. The storm's brief flashes helped me navigate back to the living room, where Diana waited patiently in the circle of candlelight. My hands were slightly unsteady as I opened to the right page. The portrait was simple, Diana by the window that morning, lost in her reading. I'd caught how the early light had softened her features, making her look somehow ageless. There was a quietness to the piece, a stillness I'd never managed to capture before. Diana went very still as she studied the drawing, and I found myself holding my breath. Rain drummed against the windows, and candlelight flickered across her face as she leaned closer to see the details. Is this ... She started, then stopped. Her finger hovered just above the paper, not quite touching. Is this how you see me? There was something raw in her voice that made my chest tight. Before I could answer, lightning split the sky again, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that made us both jump. The moment stretched between us, charged with something I wasn't ready to name. The light was perfect, I said finally, when the silence became too heavy. You looked so peaceful. I had to try to capture it. Diana was still staring at the portrait, her expression unreadable in the shifting candlelight. Outside, the storm raged on. But in here, in this pocket of warmth and shadow, time seemed to move differently. Neither of us spoke as she continued to study the drawing, and I watched the candlelight play across her face. Already itching to capture this moment too, the portrait trembled slightly in Diana's hands as she studied it. Thunder still rolling outside. Candlelight danced across the paper, bringing different details into focus. The soft curve of her shoulder as she leaned over her book, the way morning light had caught in her hair, the peace in her expression that I'd tried so carefully to capture. Is this how you see me? She asked again, her voice barely carrying over the storm. There was something vulnerable in the question, like she couldn't quite believe the evidence in front of her. I shifted closer, wanting her to understand. Yes, exactly like that. You were so absorbed in your reading, so present in that moment, not invisible at all. I gestured to specific details in the drawing. See how the light catches here. You looked ... luminous, like someone who deserves to be seen, to be captured on paper. Diana set the portrait down with deliberate care, smoothing one corner that had started to curl. When she looked up, she had moved closer, close enough that I could see the candlelight reflected in her eyes. This near, I noticed details I hadn't managed to capture in the sketch. The faint laugh lines at the corners of her eyes that she probably cursed in mirrors but which gave her face character, made it interesting, made it real. I need to ask you something, she said, her voice steady despite its softness, and I need you to really think about your answer. I nodded, suddenly aware of how the storm had created this pocket of intimacy around us, how the rest of the world felt very far away. Do you understand what we're moving toward? Her eyes held mine, unwavering. Is this real? Or is it just ... proximity and circumstance? Because I need to know if someone in their 20s really sees what they claim to see in a woman nearly 2 decades older, or if this is just a moment that feels meaningful because we're both lonely and the power's out. The question deserved careful consideration, but I already knew my answer. I'd known it that second night, watching her study my painting and name the loneliness in it with such precision. Understanding came when you looked at that canvas, I said quietly, the one I couldn't get right. You saw straight through to what it was really about, and I recognized something in how you described it. A kindred spirit, maybe. I paused, choosing my words with care. This isn't about age or circumstance. It's about seeing and being seen. Diana's breath caught slightly at that. She was close enough now that I could feel the warmth of it, could see the moment her gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before meeting my eyes again. And you're sure? She whispered. Because once we crossed this line ... I'm sure, I said. And I was sure about the connection that had been building since that first midnight arrival. Sure about the way we'd circled closer through art and conversation. Sure about this moment in all its complexity. When Diana leaned forward, it was with deliberate intent. The kiss, when it came, was careful, both of us choosing this moment with full awareness of what it meant. Her lips were soft against mine, and I kept the touch gentle, letting her set the pace. One of her hands came up to cup my cheek, and I felt the slight tremor in her fingers. The storm crashed around us, but in our circle of candlelight, everything else fell away. There was just this. The warmth of her touch, the sound of rain against windows, and the knowledge that we'd chosen this moment with clear eyes and open hearts. When Diana drew back slightly, her thumb traced along my jawline with a tenderness that made my chest ache. The candlelight caught the uncertainty that flickered across her face, but before she could voice it, I covered her hand with mine, keeping it pressed against my cheek. I see you, I whispered, the words carrying all the weight of the past few days, all our shared conversations and quiet moments. I see you completely. Diana drew back first, though her hand remained warm against my cheek. The candlelight caught the mix of emotions playing across her face. Desire, uncertainty, something that looked like regret but wasn't quite. I stayed perfectly still, giving her space to process whatever was running through her mind. There are so many complications, she said finally, her thumb tracing a gentle path along my jawline. Marcus is between us, your friend, my nephew. That connection alone, ... double quotes. She shook her head slightly. And everyone will mention the age difference. You know they will. They'll have opinions, assumptions. I nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. The storm punctuated her words with a rumble of thunder. I have a flight tomorrow afternoon, she continued, her voice getting softer. A life I have to return to, meetings and obligations and ... She trailed off, then met my eyes directly. Maybe we should stop now, while it's still just a kiss. Something we could pretend didn't happen, if we needed to. The rational part of me understood what she was offering, an easy exit, a way to preserve the connection we'd built without complicating it further. But watching her in the flickering light, seeing the way she held herself like she was bracing for rejection, I knew my answer. Those are tomorrow's problems, I said quietly. Right now, we have this moment. We have the truth of what we both want, stated clearly and understood completely. I turned my head slightly to press a kiss against her palm. Neither of us is confused about what this is or isn't. Diana searched my face, looking for any hint of doubt or hesitation. I met her gaze steadily, letting her see the certainty I felt. Whatever complications tomorrow brought, tonight was about choosing this connection we'd built, this understanding that had grown between us through art and conversation and shared loneliness. After what felt like a long moment, Diana stood. Movement was slow, deliberate, every second, giving me time to change my mind. She extended her hand toward me, the gesture both an invitation and a question. I took it without hesitation, letting her pull me to my feet. Our fingers interlaced naturally, and I noticed how perfectly our hands fit together, how warm her skin felt against mine. She led us toward the guest room, each step measured and intentional. We both understood exactly what we were choosing, what lines we were about to cross. At the threshold, Diana paused. The hallway was dark, except for the candle I'd grabbed to light our way, its glow creating a small circle of warmth around us. She turned to face me, our joined hands between us like a bridge. Last chance, she whispered, giving us both one final moment to reconsider. In response, I lifted our joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, then met her eyes in the dim light. The rain drummed steadily against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around us. Diana's free hand came up to trace the line of my collarbone, her touch feather-light but intent. The contact sent shivers across my skin despite its gentleness. "You're sure?" she asked one final time, though I could see in her eyes she already knew my answer. "I'm sure," I replied, my voice steady, despite the way my heart was racing. Instead of answering with words, Diana drew me across the threshold, the candlelight following us into the darkness beyond. Just as we crossed into the guest room, the power surged back with startling suddenness. Harsh fluorescent light flooded the hallway, making us both squint after the gentle candlelight. The abrupt brightness felt like being yanked from a dream into morning, turning our intimate moment almost comically ordinary. Diana let out a soft laugh that caught me by surprise, and I found myself joining in. There was something perfect about the universe's timing, about how quickly atmosphere could shift with just a flip of a switch. The overhead lights made everything feel exposed, clinical. The bare hallway, the slightly rumpled bedding, windows. "Well," Diana said, her hand still in mine, "that's quite the mood breaker." But there was warmth in her voice, not regret. She reached for the light switch with her free hand. "I think I prefer it how it was before." The room plunged back into darkness. Though not completely, the stormlight filtered through the windows, painting everything in silvers and shadows. "Better," I agreed, closing the door behind us with quiet certainty. The sound of the latch, clicking, felt definitive, like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. We stood facing each other in the stormlit darkness, no longer rushing but not hesitating either. Diana's face was softer in this light, more like the woman I'd drawn in that morning's portrait. Her fingers traced patterns on my palm, drawing invisible art of her own. "You know," she said softly, "I haven't felt truly seen in years. Not until I saw that portrait this evening. You showed me someone I'd forgotten existed." Her voice caught slightly. "Someone worth looking at." I brought my free hand up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing along her cheekbone. "Beauty isn't about age," I told her, meaning every word. "It's about presence, about someone who understands loneliness but still chooses connection, who sees it in others because they know it themselves." Thunder rolled through the moment, low and resonant, as if the storm approved. Diana's eyes met mine in the silver darkness, and this time when we came together, there were no more questions to ask. The rain created a sheltering wall of sound. Around us, droplets drumming against the windows in ever-changing rhythms. Inside the guest room, we'd carved out a space that felt separate from the regular world, where numbers and expectations couldn't reach. The storm-cast shadows made everything feel dreamlike, yet more real than anything I'd experienced before. Diana whispered stories against my skin, confessions that seemed only possible in darkness. She told me about her marriage, how it hadn't ended in dramatic confrontation but in quiet fading, like watercolors left too long in the sun. "He never made me feel terrible," she murmured, "just adequate. Sometimes that's worse." I shared my own fears in return, speaking them aloud for the first time. "I can paint anything technically perfect," I admitted, running my fingers through her hair, "but I'm terrified that's all I'll ever be, skilled but hollow, that I'll never create anything that actually moves people." "Your portrait moved me," she said simply, and I could hear the smile in her voice. We explored each other with careful attention, finding beauty in what society called flaws. The slight softness at her waist, the paint-stained calluses on my hands, everything became perfect in its imperfection. When I traced the laugh lines around her eyes, she didn't flinch away as she had from the harsh hallway light. You're nothing like I'd expect Marcus's aunt to be, I said, making her laugh, softly against my chest. I've never felt particularly aunt-like, she admitted. Just myself, wearing different roles that never quite fit right. This is the first time in years I've felt ... unscripted. The storm began to gentle as dawn approached, rain falling softer. Now, more like whispers than demands. Diana lay with her head on my chest, both of us aware of morning's approach, but unwilling to acknowledge it. The room was growing lighter by degrees, but we stayed wrapped in our created darkness. Do you regret this? I asked quietly, needing to know. She was silent for a moment, then said, only that it happened just once. Her fingers traced absent patterns on my skin, like she was trying to memorize the moment through touch alone. I woke to the smell of fresh coffee and found Diana already dressed, perched by the window in the living room. She'd pulled one of Marcus's kitchen chairs over to watch the sunrise paint the rain-slicked streets in shades of gold. Something about her was different. She wore the same clothes from that first night, but her presence felt more solid now, more anchored in the space she occupied. 2 coffee mugs sat on the windowsill, steam curling up to fog the glass. Without turning from her view, she said softly, my flight's at 3 o'clock. I called a car for noon. I crossed the room to join her, bare feet silent on the hardwood. When she handed me one of the mugs, our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away immediately. That small point of contact held more meaning than it should have. I'm leaving the portrait here, she said, nodding toward where it rested on the easel. I want you to keep working on it, to remember that someone saw you fully, even if it was just for a moment. The morning light caught the silver in her hair, and I had to resist the urge to capture it in charcoal right then. Are you going to tell Marcus about... I let the question trail off. She smiled, a private expression I recognized from the night before. Some stories belong only to the people who lived them, don't you think? When she stood to gather her things, her movements were unhurried, deliberate. She'd already packed her suitcase. Somehow I'd slept through that, but she took her time collecting her coat. Her phone, checking for anything left behind. At the door, she paused and turned back. Being seen, she said carefully, really seen. It's its own kind of beautiful. Thank you for that. After she left, I found her phone number written on the back of one of my sketches, the one of her reading by the window that first morning. Not a promise, just a possibility hanging in the air like the last notes of a song. If this chapter felt like it was meant for you, subscribe and ring the bell. Tomorrow's may be the hand you didn't know you were reaching for.